And I hope nobody showed up last week, but I think it was probably a good idea since I think I had the snow blow 3 times at the end of that storm. So let me. First of all, it's really great to be here. The Otter Creek Audubon Society is a wonderful group, and if you're not members, really do think about it. This isn't a pitch you asked me to give, because you're just a wonderful bunch of environmentalists and conservationists, and I appreciate being here, really. You know, I often use the quote, "May you live in interesting times." And I thought tonight before I came up here, well, I ought to figure out who I can attribute that quote to. And so I looked it up, and if you can believe the internet, apparently it's like a Chinese curse. And which makes it even more appropriate that I've been saying it for the last 5 years. But this is really a very interesting story, and beyond that quote, there are other quotes to think about, which is from the White Nose Syndrome Science Committee, which basically came to the conclusion that we're experiencing the most precipitous decline in wildlife in North America in recorded history. And it's really fascinating and at the same time very, very scary. And let's see, I can almost see there we are, great. You can drop those if you like, that's all right, I can figure it out. Okay, well I'll try to walk myself in the dark here. I may be able to do it through this, so we'll see. I've often also said that we are actually living in an ecological experiment right now with this precipitous decline in these bat species across North America. Oh, that won't do it. So I'll just work it through here. This is Iola's Cave, going back to 2009, 2010, 2011, the same place in the cave walls. And we've seen what was typically an awful lot of bats in clusters, and now there are none. But before we get into the story of white nose syndrome, let's talk about these incredible, what I often will use the term fascinating creatures here in the state of Vermont. We've got 9 species of bats here. Now for most people, and it's understandable, a bat is a bat is a bat. It's flying, it's dark, whatever, it's a bat. But we do have 9 very distinct groups of species of bats here. And I probably should have been a teacher, so I will continue to quiz you through the night. So it's important that you pay attention here. I think the easiest thing to think about are our bats in 2 groups initially. The cave bats and the migratory bats, or the migratory tree bats. Now, most people are familiar with the concept of our cave bats. Many people don't realize that we have 3 species of bats that actually migrate out of here during the winter months and do not hibernate in caves or mines. But we've got 6 species of cave bats and 3 species of migratory tree bats. Now, I'll break down those cave bats into 2 groups for you. The house bats and the forest bats. Now, I bet you can tell me which of those 2 groups lives in people's houses, right? Okay. And here's our first bat that is a house bat. I often have said, you know, the first bat biologists must have been some of the most creative people around to sit around the table wondering what we should call this species, and they came up with little brown bat. But it essentially is a little brown bat. Its body is about the size of my thumb. It weighs 7 grams, which is equivalent to 3 pennies. So if you have 3 pennies in your hand, that's what it would weigh. And before white nose syndrome, was our most common bat in the state of Vermont, if not North America. And when people would call and say, I have hundreds and thousands of bats in my chimney or whatever, it most likely were little brown bats. Now, the other house bat is, again, very interestingly named big brown bat. And do you know which one is the larger of the 2? And in essence, really, this is a very important picture because this is a little brown bat and this is a big brown bat. And so this animal here is about more than twice the size of a little brown bat. It is the only species that can hibernate in the attics of people's homes or in basements. And so when we get a cold, cold day in January or a warm, warm day in January or February, and that phone rings and they say, oh, there's a bat flying around in my house, it's a big brown bat, okay? The forest bats, so we have two house bats, right? The little brown and the big brown. And now we have bats that are not necessarily associated with houses. And this one is called the tricolored bat. And it's called the tricolored bat because if I were to blow on its hair, I could see three different shades on its hair. It was once called the pipistrelle, the eastern pipistrelle, for those who might have heard of it. But with genetics, they found out it's not at all related to pipistrelle in Europe. And so we renamed it the tricolored bat. I can tell mostly from its orange forearms. Work done in Canada found that the bat likes to roost during the daytime in bearded lichens. So you can see that there you are sitting in here in the middle of this lichen. No predator is going to be able to find you in that. And we have one of my favorites is the northern long-eared bat. You can tell this because its ears are almost embarrassingly long. It is perhaps was maybe the second most common bat in the state of Vermont before white nose. It was very skilled at flying in what we call clutter, which are dense understories. This bat, keep in mind, these animals are sending out echolocation at night. This bat could really weave in between high densities of trees. And we actually now know it was primarily a gleaner. It would land, pick up the bug on the ground or on the leaf. Fascinating animal. And one that has caused me to spend an awful lot of time in the Middlebury area is the Indiana bat, which is very dense in numbers in the Champlain Valley of Vermont, perhaps as dense as anywhere in the country. You say anyone would look at that and say, is that a little brown bat? Is that an Indiana bat? Who knows? But of course you people know that if you looked at the toe hairs, and if in fact the toe hairs extended beyond the toenails, that it would be a little brown bat versus essentially a naked foot.
So obvious.
So obvious, right? And the last forest bat is the small-footed bat, which is our smallest one. You can tell it has this darker mask on its face, a small foot. And through radiotelemetry, we have found that these animals roost in south and west-facing cliffs. The little cracks in the rock walls, that's where your female small-footed bats are roosting, and that's where they're having their young. So it's really, while it's a forest bat, it doesn't roost in trees, it roosts in cliffs. Or we have a colony of 30 of these in someone's slate roof in Rutland County as well. I threw this character in because, first of all, test, can anyone tell me what species this might be? Northern long-eared. Good. I put it in there because take a very good look at it. This is the last northern long-eared bat that I've seen this past fall, but we really do, as you'll find out, have grave concerns about whether this species can survive in Vermont in the next 10 or so years. And then we get to our migratory tree bats. There's a hoary bat in that plastic case there, and I encourage you to look at it. They are beautiful. They are, if our little brown bat is 7 grams, this bat is about 25 grams. It's our biggest bat in Vermont. When we catch them in the mesh net, I certainly ask someone else to go and grab it while I go do something else more important, because it is a big bat with big teeth, and but a fascinating animal for sure, and a beautiful animal. The second species is the red bat, and what's never mind how gorgeous these animals are, but this is a trait of our migratory bats, is you see the fur on the tail, whereas our cave bats really have naked tails. And this is because this animal really is migrating, is not going into torpor in the wintertime, and this really helps it stay warm. And the last species that's a migratory bat is the silver-haired bat, which is, it used to be, in some of the earliest records in Vermont, Vermont's most common bat. And our records of it really have been almost non-existent in the recent times. I will say that more and more of these are showing up at wind energy facilities to kind of demonstrate that our survey techniques aren't sufficient to track this species.
You mean they're showing up on the ground underneath?
Yes, yes. They're effectively, with the other migratory tree bats, getting killed there. So just a quick review. You can break bats into which two groups? House, yes, or our cave. First cave and migratory. And the cave bats can be broken into what? House, forest. Perfect. Wonderful. You guys are getting there. We like it. You'll be bat experts when you're all done. All of our bats are under the order of Chiroptera, which means hand wing. And this is a skeleton of a big brown, and literally this is its upper arm, its forearm, its wrist. That there is the thumb, and these are 4 fingers. And it literally is flying with its hands, okay? They make up about 1/4 of all the mammals on the earth. So it's a very diverse group, a group of animals that have been here a very long time. I continually use the word fascinating. I suspect that any biologist who studies an animal thinks theirs is the most fascinating, but they're all wrong. This animal is not a flying mouse, okay? It's very different. This is an animal that lives 20 to 30 years, and it has 1 pup per year. Before I studied bats, I studied black bears for a while, and I was looking at a 150-pound female bear that lived to be 20 to 30 years of age, and it had 2 cubs often every other year. And then I switched to studying a 7-gram animal and found out it lived to be 20 to 30 years of age, and it had 1 pup every year. Very low reproductive rate. And why that's important is because when the sweetest species of bats has a disease that's hit them as hard as white nose syndrome, they are not bouncing back really quickly. They have a low reproductive rate because they have evolved with very good survival skills in the past. They are fascinating in the fact of how they can actually survive flying around in the dark. They send out, when they are simply flying around searching, about 10 pulses of high-frequency echolocations out of their mouth every second, 10 pulses per second. If they see something, yes?
Is the frequency of both the human ear, or could we hear it?
Aha, I love it, I love it. Just wait 1 minute, I will answer that. Don't let me leave this slide without answering that question. If they see something they like, they will send out pulses at about 200 per second. So they can hone in. So imagine getting all that information back so quickly in the dark by what we believe are those little pointy traguses within their ears, and their mind being able to figure out what is going on. The frequencies that they do send these echolocations out are typically, in the cave bats, between 40 kilohertz and 110 kilohertz. The hoary bat is the one bat who sends it out between 18 kilohertz and about 25 kilohertz. And for those of you who are younger than 21 or so, you can hear the 18 kilohertz. But once you get to be a little bit older than that, you lose that ability. And so many times some of the younger people working with me will say, oh, I can hear that hoary bat. And I think they're lying, of course, but that's the difference. That's the only bat that we can hear is the hoary bat. All the others have a frequency higher.
Have you any idea, could you describe what kind of sound it might be, even though I'll never hear it?
Well, it's very much, it's very much like a fast clicking. And so when we do have these acoustic detectors which can actually record the sound and then play it on a computer, it is portrayed as just a very fast click. And so it's going ahead and you're going tick, 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 tick. And then when it picks up, say, a moth, it'll be zip. And that's how fast those frequencies are being sent out. And lastly, they're fascinating because they would make good teenagers. They can hibernate for about 40% of their year. But really, think of it. You weigh 7 grams, and you've got to have enough fat on you to hibernate from November until mid-April. And how do you, in fact, evolve to be able to survive spending a whole winter in a cave? Quick bat biology on our cave bats, only our cave bats, is this time of year they are hibernating. They wake up every 12, 14, 15 days, kind of kick their immune system in maybe a little bit, get some water, go back in. The females are impregnated already, but they're storing the sperm. They're not going to spend any energy trying to take care of a fertilized egg. When they come out in mid-April, the females initiate pregnancy. They fly to pretty much the same maternity colony site year after year. If it's a tree, house, whatever, and they have one pup born in mid-June, and then literally once those pups are flying in about 3 weeks, they begin to start heading back to the cave where the breeding occurs during what we call the fall swarm. And so you really are spitting out, you're getting pregnant, and you're giving birth in a very short time, and those bats have to get back to hibernate and be able to hibernate as soon as the insects disappear.
So do the ones that don't hibernate, the ones that migrate, they don't hibernate at all?
Well, if you're a red bat and you're in South Carolina and we had that polar vortex come through, what those red bats do is they do go into a state of torpor. And actually, research have shown so many of them will actually just drop to the ground and go under the leaf litter for a few days until it warms up. And so they still have the ability to go into torpor, but they don't go into any kind of long-term hibernation like the other bats do. All of our bats in Vermont eat insects. They can eat about 1/2 their weight each night. I can catch a bat at dusk at 7 grams, and I can catch the same bat in a couple hours, and it's weighing 10 grams. And for those who always like to figure things out, it's kind of like me sitting down and having, I believe it's a 200 quarter-pound hamburgers at a meal. If that isn't disgusting, I don't know what is. But we do know while they consume some mosquitoes, they're primary predators of moths and beetles in particular. But they do play a role in pest control across our country. So that is why bats are fascinating, why we should care about them. What is happening is really just phenomenal. And it started in Vermont in 2008, and it started a year earlier, at least in the state of New York. Vermonters started calling me up and saying, "It's January, Mr. Darling, why are these bats flying around outside my house?" And they're on my roof getting sunshine. And when we went to some caves, we would find dead bats around those caves on the outside. And these bats here were in the middle of January leaving the cave, apparently thinking that that was the wrong place to be. In 2009 is the year, this is the second year of white nose syndrome. We have essentially a population collapse in the state of Vermont. This is the floor of Aeolus Cave in Dorset, which really has become the national poster child of what white nose syndrome can do to a population. This is the most important hibernaculum in all of New England. It's been studied by a professor out of Middlebury College back in the 60s and has estimated to have about 300,000 bats in it. Today, it probably has closer to 25 to 30,000 bats in it. It is about the only remaining significant hibernacula in Vermont. If you go to Aeolus Cave now and you look on the cave floor, these aren't pine needles. These are the bones, the wing bones of bats. And if you look carefully, you can see some skulls in there. And the floor is literally carpeted like this. You cannot step anywhere without stepping on bat bones. The rest of Vermont and some of our other hibernacula that we monitor, so we go into these caves in the wintertime, count the bats quickly, get out. You can see this tremendous collapse that occurred here in 2009 and 10. And in 2010, we repeated all of our mist-net surveys in Vermont. We went to all 30 different sites where we once had captured 339 little browns. We could capture 2 in 2010. And for northern long-eared bats, where we once caught 82, we could catch only 5. So we really experienced, in the two-year time frame, an incredible collapse of close to 93 to 99% in our northern long-eared bats, and anywhere from 76 to 99% in our little brown bats. You can't go in the literature and find a decline like that in a suite of species in that short of a time frame. What happened? Well, we know now that it was a fungus, and it's a cold-loving fungus, and unlike most fungi, if you've had athlete's foot, for example, it doesn't kill you, it just itches. But what this fungus did is, and this is a picture, this is a hair follicle on a bat's wing, and this is the hyphae of the fungus, and if you look carefully, you can see it going down in between the hair follicle. And this fungus literally sent these hyphae down, and it began to deteriorate the tissue within the wing. And so all of these bats that were getting infected with white nose syndrome, their wings were being really shredded, and there was an awful lot of dead tissue in them. And some of their mortality probably had to do with the fact that they just couldn't fly very well. But this, again, extremely unusual for a fungus to kill its host. And that's what this was doing at that time. We now know it is the same fungus that is in Northern Europe. And the genome has been evaluated for both the Northern Europe fungus and the American fungus, and they're almost identical. Now, if you go to Northern Europe and you go in their caves, which isn't easy to do because Europe is very, very, very protective of their bats, you will see 20, 30, 50 bats in a cave. You will not see 300,000 like we once did. And one bit of speculation is that Northern Europe or Europe already had its collapse from white nose syndrome. Who knows? We don't know that. There was some interesting work going on with inoculating European bats with the American strain, North American strain, and vice versa. But it seems to me that the evidence is clear. This fungus came to North America from Northern Europe, and our bats had never been exposed to it before.
Is the color coding significant?
No, it's not. Only for aesthetic purposes. This color coding, however, is significant, and that if it's a breakdown of the disease by year, it really started. Here's the epicenter in New York at a cave there, and quickly in 2008, it spread throughout New England, a little bit of Pennsylvania, and now it essentially is across here. I was talking to someone earlier about, Wisconsin and Michigan are probably two states with significant bat population, particularly Wisconsin, that we are, I don't know if we're optimistic, but we're hopeful that it'll never enter there. But you can see Nova Scotia, all through Canada, this disease exists. And work done with some population models even predicted the little brown bat, not the northern long-eared bat, which I referred to, which I think is even in worse shape here in Vermont. The models would show a possible extinction by 2026. Our most common bat essentially disappearing from us in a matter of 15 years. So what does it take? How did the Vermont Fish and Wildlife Department respond to this? Well, the reality is we felt fully engaged. We were fully engaged in it at the national and regional level, anywhere from monitoring our bat populations. One of the things that we were very fortunate of is we had done a lot of work from the Indiana bat work and across the state of Vermont. So we had a better feel for our bat populations in Vermont than many states. But we needed to do an awful lot more data collection and try to monitor our populations, see what was happening to them. We were involved in congressional hearings, and we've been involved with many other states and the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service in partnerships to begin to solve this issue. So we should be proud of our role in this. And we're at a point now, it's been a while, what do? We just keep monitoring this decline? And no is the answer to that. There's probably three paths to a possible solution to white nose syndrome. The first, which would be wonderful, would be to find a treatment for the fungus. They are looking at biological controls, other fungi that might eat this fungus. They are looking at chemical controls, and we do have chemical agents that can actually kill the fungus in a petri dish. The trouble is, how do you put it on a bat? And unfortunately, these guys, when they're hibernating, that's not the time to go to apply them with all kinds of liquids or a vaccination or whatever, because just merely waking them up more and more to do that depletes them of their fat reserves during the winter time. And so if we were to do any kind of vaccination or anything like that, it would probably be in the fall when they're swarming at the cave entrances. More likely, I think, we need to affirm whether in fact there's resistance to the disease. We know we have bats that have survived exposure to white nose syndrome. We actually had bats in Cornwall Swamp Bridge that we banded in 2006. And so they've made it all the way through white nose syndrome. Why, how, I haven't a clue. But we're doing some work to affirm or not whether the surviving bats, the bats that are left, are resistant to this disease. And lastly, you may have heard of what we call our Noah's Ark strategy, that if there's no treatment and if they're not resistant and they continue to die and decrease in numbers, do we apply what we call this Noah's Ark strategy of just trying to store them somewhere away from the fungus to see if they can make it? Yes?
On that middle thing, is that research, that destructive research, meaning that the ones that aren't resistant die?
Oh yes, what that means is essentially are the ones that are here now, are they either genetically or whatever resistant to the disease, and so they're going to continue to survive. Those that aren't resistant have already been dead now. Okay, do you follow me? So what we're
How do you test for
How are you
resistance?
testing it?
aha. Well, so we're testing it a couple ways, and I'll get into those very shortly, okay? Great. And the Noah's Ark concept here, this is an aerial photo of an abandoned military bunker, and I'll talk about some of the work we've done there. So on the resistance front, there's two pieces of work that we're doing. If not, there's more than that. There's three. The first is we're involved in a regional banding study, and this is the Vermont site is Plymouth Cave, where we can go in and actually, just before they emerge in the spring, grab those bats, band them. And you can see here's a cluster of little brown bats, and gosh, they all have a band on them. And we go back the following year and we find out how many of these bats return. And we have found basically about a 50% return rate. Now there's a little bit of an unknown which makes it a problem, which is, do they go to a different cave, or did they, or are there other bats that are coming in here as well from other sites? And so we're getting a handle on it. We do have survivors, which is a good thing. I think we're this year involved in a much more intensive study at Aeolus Cave, where we actually went in the fall, where these bats are swarming, and we put up what we call a harp trap. And it's not a great picture, but there's little fishing lines going in here. And as these bats swarm around the cave entrance, they kind of hit that fishing line and fall into this plastic bag. And what we're doing in this case is applying what we call pit tags, which are passive integrated transponders, which is basically, it's this little red, very narrow strip. It was in the earlier picture. And often those are inserted. You remember, people might have a pet that has pit tagged, so you can scan it and it would come up with, number 146252, that's your dog. And we did not want to do this with what is now a state-listed species, of inserting this, what almost is like putting a cucumber in the back of your neck, because that's what it feels like with this small bat and this relatively long pit tag. But what we did was we just parted their hair, put some glue on the pit tag, applied it to their skin, put a little talcum powder on it to dry, and patched them up, and they all ended up, about 500, with this little pit tag backpack on their back. And the idea is, in Aeolus Cave now, we have these pit tag readers. This is, if you go into Aeolus Cave, there's this big guano hall that was the poster child of all those dead bats. But those bats fly through this little passage here. And in here is what we call these readers that will, as this bat flies through, it'll go boop, And this device right in here will record that that bat entered on this day at this time. And we're actually going to end up with a survival rate. How many bats go in and how many bats come out. And that's going to be perhaps the best data on the survival rate of bats infected with white nose syndrome in the country. And if there's a high survival rate, then we really have to believe that it's either the disease is leveling off or that these animals are in fact resistant to the disease. The other part of this equation is not just finding out if they're resistant, but making sure that there is not any additional mortality on these bats. And in Vermont, we've started what is really on a regional level considered a significant effort of a Got Bats campaign. And yes, we even went to the California Dairy Association to make sure we could use that term. And this young woman who's working with me has done an awful great job of trying to identify houses, places where there are colonies of bats. And she has up to 600 colonies of bats that are known. And interestingly enough, after 3 years of this exercise, these are the only little brown bat colonies that we're aware of. And you'll notice that primarily, with the exception of 2, they're all in the Champlain Valley. They're all probably in our better bat habitat. For those in the Champlain Valley, guess what? It's buggier here. And it's warmer here, and bats do better there. But we really have as good a documentation of where these colonies are. And so we're able to go there, watch the bats come out, and we actually be able to track. And what is interesting, over the last 2 years, the total number of bats that we've been keeping track of is almost identical. And so there's the good news is, gee, maybe they're not continuing to decline like they once were. And Alyssa also will, if someone has bats in their house and they don't want them in their house, she will work directly with them to help them exclude the bats in a way that won't harm the bats. And this has been a real boon for us. And she spends an awful lot of time in her summer working with homeowners who have bats and want to be cautious about it. The other element of reducing mortality is wind energy. We in Vermont have been pretty aggressive in this, and it's important to note that most of the fatalities that occur at wind energy facilities are the migratory bats, and so they're migrating in the late summer, early fall to head south, and for whatever reason they are really running into turbines, and we do not know why. There's a whole bunch of hypotheses, but we don't know why.
They must fly quite high there.
Pardon?
They must fly quite high and hit the turbine.
They do fly quite high. They do fly quite high, which is why we often never pick them up in our surveys or mist nets or anything like that, because they're way above us here. And so each of our wind facilities in Vermont, there's 4 that are operating, 3 that have the taller turbines that impact bats. They have to do monitoring of these. And this is the case of Sheffield facility. Last year killed an estimated 235 bats, about almost 15 per turbine per year. Now that seems like a lot, and it is more than we want. But all of our facilities in Vermont are required to do what we call curtail. Yes?
On the previous slide, is that pie chart, is that death rate proportional to the population as well, or is there?
No, this would be of those animals that are killed, 54% are hoary bats, 16%. But, are you asking, are there more hoary bats? Is the reason? Yeah, probably so. Probably so.
And the fewest is the silver-haired one?
Right. Mm-hmm.
Okay, so it is kind of...
I would suspect it is, unless one of these bat species has either a behavioral characteristic that makes it more vulnerable to wind facilities. Yep, good question. But in Vermont, all of our facilities are required to do what we call curtail, which is what was very easy for me to figure out as a conclusion, is early on in 2004 when we first heard about bats being killed by wind facilities, we found out that they were being killed when the winds were really low in wind speed, and the rotors are just turning around not making electricity. Now I think most of you would say, that doesn't make much sense. Why would they bother to turn the rotors around if they're not making electricity? So what we can do is have the facilities curtail, in other words, don't have the rotor spin, until the wind is windy enough that the bats aren't flying as much. And then you can make electricity when it's windy, because that's when they really want to make electricity. And so 6 meters per second is our cutoff for all of our wind facilities. If the wind is blowing at 5 meters per second and the bats are flying, the turbines are not turning. And this can reduce your mortality of bats anywhere from 45 to 90%. And so up until recently, we were the only state to require that. Maine has since followed suit and is requiring that as well.
What is that footnote? I don't understand.
Yeah, well, it's RPMs, rounds per minute, or revolutions per minute, around 1 prior to cut-in. So they can't lock their rotors in because of their warranties, but they can make sure that they can pitch the rotors so it never goes more than 1 revolution per minute around at below cut-in speed.
And cut-in speed
is the 6 meters per second. So what a rotor do, if my arm could be a rotor on a Vermont wind turbine, it's now running 5 meters per second wind speed, okay? That rotor's doing this, okay, just slowly. So a bat's going to fly around and having trouble. But when it gets to be 6 meters per second, then it kicks in and that rotor is going. Now hopefully, as the wind speeds get above 6 meters per second, the bats are not flying as much. It's too windy. If you weighed 3 pennies and it was windy, it'd be a wicked ride. And so that's the kind of the agreement that we've made to try to address this issue.
So you're saying that if the rotor is moving slowly, the bats don't have...
Right, one RPM, we're believing we're not getting that kind of mortality. Now, a lot of people, even when you go to a wind facility and you watch a rotor spinning, they say, geez, I can't believe a bat, can't get around that. You can see a fishing line. But it is interesting. That rotor, the tip of that rotor is going almost 180, 200 miles an hour. And so it really is a very fast device, even though it looks slower than it is. And so finally, the last effort, which we were involved in, is testing Noah's Ark strategy. Can we take an abandoned military bunker from the World War II era and Cold War era and change it so that it could actually hold bats as kind of a refugia for the winter? Can we get our bats out of this cave that has all this fungus and move them here, hold them over the winter, and then put them back? And two winters ago now, we simply went to Aeola's cave, caught a bunch of bats, put them in a refrigerator, drove to Maine, Aroostook County, Maine, which they had prepared the bunker with all kinds of things that bats would like, all kinds of toys, and brought in our bats. We had New York bats and Vermont bats, and we basically shut the door here in Aroostook County, and our bat bunker here is where our bats spent the winter. We came back in the end of March to go get them, and basically we had 30% survival rate. Well, what we learned from that was you could take infected bats. If you took infected bats from Vermont, brought them to a clean environment, they would still die. What you need to do is have clean bats go to a clean environment, and they would probably survive. So we did learn that, this alone won't work. It might work if we could come up with a treatment for bats, and instead of putting them in the cave, which was infected, put them in somewhere like a military bunker. But you can imagine the kind of labor that would require to do that on a level that would be meaningful. So I'll close with just a few comments. And we were talking about a little bit earlier, I think we need to think about things even beyond bats, just with the what I often call the ecological infrastructure that we have here. And literally in the last 6-7 years, we have had chytrid fungus hit our amphibian populations globally. There are many, many species of amphibians that are now extinct because of this fungus. We've been talking about the honeybee colony collapse disorder, and now we've got something happening to our bats. So you've got animals low on the food chain, pollinators, and our primary nighttime predator of insects, all in the last 8 years having tremendous problems. I think that's a red flag for us. An interesting book by Elizabeth Colbert just came out. She suggests this new Pangea where all of the continents were together and they separated, splitting all of these species. And now really what humans are doing is they're creating another new Pangea where we're essentially bringing all of the organisms around. And so that the ocean that separated Europe from North America is essentially kind of disappearing because we're moving so many of these organisms around the globe. Just so you don't just want to, drink yourself to death, there are things still that we can do to help bats. And really, it is from releasing them safely, excluding them without harming them. If you've got an existing colony or your neighbor has an existing colony in their house, we are still recommending putting up bat houses, because if your neighbor ever decides to sell the house or decide they don't want the bats there, there's another place for them to go. Dead and dying trees are forest bats' heaven. That's what they need for their maternity colonies. Buffers and hedgerows, stream buffers remain very important. And what's I think maybe the most important is just telling your friends and neighbors how valuable bats are. I will tell you a very good story, which is we work closely with pest control agents in the state of Vermont. They're not licensed. Anyone can go and say, "Oh, I'll help you get rid of your bats." And we have worked very closely with them. But when we talk to them, they say, it's funny. I got clients in New Hampshire, and they tell me, "Hey, you get rid of these darn bats. I don't want them in this house." And he says, then I get over to the other side of the river, and they go, "I don't want the bats in my house, but you better not hurt them." And that tells me the Vermonters kind of get it, and they understand that. And making sure that your friends and neighbors do too will be a big help as well. So thank you very much, and we can offer any questions, comments. Yeah.
I was
Yes.
just wondering if all the people that are all of a sudden making sure that there are no bats in their house, could that have led by overcrowding the caves to making this become worse? If the bats can't be in these houses, then they've got to go somewhere.
You mean would they be abandoning the houses and going to the caves? I mean, well, many of those, the instances where bats are in people's houses, there's two instances. One is a maternity colony, so the females all go together. The guys kind of stay separate. They're just waiting to go back to the caves with the ladies. But the females are in their maternity colonies with other females. And if it's a house bat, you may notice them, boy, now there's a whole bunch, or the young are flying and they're flying in the wrong door and they're coming in the living room. That's one instant. And the other incident is the big brown bat in the wintertime. And so that bat really, while we do find the big brown bat in the caves, I suspect about 85% of those are actually in houses in the wintertime. So you don't have this influx, this movement of the cave bats from houses to the cave.
But that can't be helping the bats, people.
To exclude them?
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, here's one of the fascinating things about bats is bats have evolved primarily in trees. These forest bats all used trees before us people gave them dwellings to work, to live in. Eventually, at some point in time, the little brown bats and the big brown bats said, "Geez, let's just go to the log cabin down the road. It's warmer than this." But prior to that, they roosted in dead and dying trees. Now, if you were in a dead and dying tree, it could be here today and gone tomorrow. And so these bats are wired to have many places, many plans. And for those Indiana bats that we followed with radio transmitters for years in this area, they would have about 14, 15 different trees they would use. So one of them fell down, they've got 13 more. So they're always looking around. They always have a plan B, which is kind of neat. And so even if you excluded them from your house, they would say, "No problem, we got Mrs. Smith down the road." And that's what they would do. And so ultimately, why we talk about bat houses still is that maybe they'll go to a bat house and not Mrs. Smith's house.
You kept talking about houses, but what about barns?
Barns, absolutely right. In the summer, barns are tremendous maternity colony sites. Big browns and little browns. Yep, absolutely.
But they winter in a cave.
They winter in a cave, or the big brown bat would winter in the house. The barns typically are too cold to hibernate in. Yes, you had a question.
You talked about the sudden population crash of bats. I was thinking of the passenger pigeon. Is there no comparable precise data to show how rapidly the passenger pigeon disappeared?
There is, and that's the other model that is shown, is perhaps that's one that's somewhat comparable to that. Again, we're probably looking at, we estimated in about 4 years' time, we lost about 5.6 to 7 million bats across the eastern United States. The passenger pigeon was another example of a heavily populated species that collapsed very quickly. I don't think it was a 3-year period, but it was quick, though, I am told.
We don't have precise data.
Right. But very good for picking that up, because that is another example they point to. Yes? You have a question? Oh, okay, how about yes?
Yeah, I noticed on one of your slides you had a comparison of the bat droppings to mice and so on.
Right.
Actually, I told you earlier we saw one bat last year in our property. And actually, when I went up to the barn wall, there were these droppings all over up there. So that would suggest there are more bats there than just one.
Right. And they're transient at certain times of the year. I don't know what it is. I've got 2 big brown bats that show up in my garage literally in August for a period of time, and it's fun because I know they're there and I know how much guano they make in X days. And they poop a lot for sure. But it did raise one of the interesting things that we're observing, which I think is an interesting scientific phenomenon, which is where we used to catch little browns and no big browns, we now see big browns. And they seem to be doing a very good job of colonizing the abandoned little brown bat habitat. And there are people who said, gee, I used to have lots of little browns in my house, and we can show you old guano, but now there are just big browns there. So it is an interesting dynamic that maybe that species will become the more common one in Vermont. Yes?
This is a question about their habitat, and you kind of referencing Europe, Northern Europe. And I'm wondering, because in the Adirondacks and in northern New England and stuff, they habitated over the winter in old mines.
Right.
Now, these old mines have all become flooded as they become obsolete or non-profit. They're not making money anymore, and they become flooded. Now, is that affecting that flooding of their habitat, making them go other places? Is there some sort of something that could be happening in the water and that sort of thing?
Yeah, well, very good question. We used to have, there is a mine, Elizabeth Mine in Vermont, over in Stratford, that actually probably had bat populations comparable to Aeolus. We used to go there in the fall swarm and just bats all over. But many of these mines do have some water in them, but where they have traditionally held bats historically, there weren't flood events. Every once in a while there's a cave or mine which can have what we call a flood event, which can kill a bunch of bats. But most of these, particularly over in New York and even Elizabeth Mine, are very, very deep, big old mines, and they don't completely flood at all. Yeah. Great. Yes?
Regarding the bat houses, like the bat houses that we may make to put affixed to the side of the barn or put on a post in the yard.
Right.
I don't know the last time you Googled how to make a bat house, but there's a lot of information.
Yes.
And it contradicts and.
Right.
So do you recommend the average citizen putting up a bat house on their property, or is it not always a good thing?
Great question. Great question. I'm glad you asked that. And we have stuff on our website because we have researched, what is it you want in Vermont, and you want a bat house that's painted dark. You probably want a double chamber, just because it holds
How
mass.
big is the slit?
3/4 inch, so all of this stuff. You can take this,
Okay, great.
but it is an important question because we've had so much interest in helping bats, and making bat houses is often a project people come up with. And gee, we had the Springfield prison make, I don't know, 120 bat houses for us to give away, which was fantastic. And again, if you don't have bats in your area at this point in time, and you know that your neighbor doesn't have them in their house or whatever, it's not worth you putting it up.
But if you see them
but
around in the summertime,
if you
swarming around the house, whether you know they're living there or not,
Then I would put it up.
okay, great.
If you've got them there, I would put it up.
I mean,
And
if
getting
nothing
8...
else, we're encouraging natural pest control around our own home.
Yeah, and you're finding a very suitable roosting site, particularly if these are house bats, which might get excluded down the road. I mean, we have, about 15 little brown bat colonies we're really monitoring closely, but there are several instances there where the people are moving. The house is for sale. And so we're working with a realtor to say, geez, have the prospective buyers call us, because we want them, we'll help them. If they needed the bats excluded, we'll do that. But even putting up bat houses now is a good idea, so that when the day comes, if the bats are excluded, they have their plan B, which is, oh yeah, there's a great bat house just down the river. Let's go there.
And,
Yeah.
and this will address what time of year to put up your bat house? Because
Yeah, you
there's
can-
a lot of particulars, aren't there?
Well, you can put the bat house up at any time of year. Your best bet is just get it up in the spring and hope for the best. Sometimes it takes 2-3 years for them to find them. But if they're around quite a bit, they will check it out because they know, let's look at all the options.
Is it ever a bad thing for any one of us to put up a bat house on our property?
No,
Great, thanks.
no. Great. Yes?
You talked about bats liking dead trees. Are there live trees that they choose?
Yeah, thank you, because yes. The shagbark hickory in particular for the Indiana bat, and actually even the northern long-eared bat still likes it. So that tree in particular, along with the locust, are live trees that have furrows in their bark, or what looks like exfoliating bark that these bats can get under. And literally, you can go and look at, say, how these great old elms have loose bark on them. A patch of bark that's loose, that's this big, I've counted 30 or so Indiana bats coming out of it. So it really is, those kind of trees are just really critical for them, especially if they're getting solar radiation that helps keep them warm. But thanks for raising that, because, yeah, that is true. That's an exception in this area. Yes?
They don't use old woodpecker holes and cavities.
The northern long-eared bat does, but not the Indiana bat. And I should say, I did not mention that the northern long-eared bat is proposed for federal listing now, and that the service has made a recommendation to list it as federally endangered, which would add to the Indiana bat, which is federally endangered in Vermont as well.
What about the intersection of Dutch elm disease and I mean, a lot of elm trees are in danger.
Mm-hmm.
And cutting the ones down before it spreads to the neighbor across the yard.
Right.
Versus the needs of the bat.
Right. Well, without a doubt, that's just fine to do, because there's lots of roost trees out there. It's just, if it's a really good one that's getting a lot of solar radiation, that's where we would suggest you cut it down in the wintertime. Or what you can do first is go and actually watch the tree in the summer at dusk and see if any bats are using it. And if they're not, then you can feel comfortable that that's probably not a roost tree used by bats.
Tell her to not cut it down.
But the whole forest products industry and everything in Vermont is a little bit antsy about the issue of northern long-eared bats, and we've been working with the forestry community quite a bit, particularly in the Champlain Valley here, about trying to make sure we're not harming Indiana bats through our forest practices. Yeah. Great. Yes?
Related to the fungus, you suggested that it's not in the fungus interest to kill their host. And I was wondering if the situation in Northern Europe is any different in the sense, does the fungus act in a similar way, or does it not kill the bat?
Yeah, their observations of mortality from the fungus are almost non-existent there now. And there's some interesting work done on the genetics of the fungus here in North America, and interestingly enough, it has changed a little bit between when it got to Vermont and New York than it is in Tennessee and Kentucky right now. And so whether this fungus is realizing, geez, you know, it doesn't help me to kill my host, so I'm going to evolve to be a little bit less virulent on my host. That's, you know, one theory behind it. But yeah, that's, you know, that's when we sent pictures over to Europe of this fungus on bats' noses. They said, what's wrong with you guys? We've got that here. We see that. And we're like, you do? And it's, again, the speculation is the mortality event already occurred there. Yep. Yes, we'll go to you. Yes?
So does the only reason you see it on the nose, is that because the hair is shorter there? Is it all over their body?
It's, I had some pictures which you could see it on their wings, on their ears. The nose we felt was just because of the moisture. There was an increased moisture there. Interestingly enough, you don't see the fungus now on the bats in Vermont in the caves, and I don't know why that is. Yeah, you don't. By year 3, we were going in the caves and you weren't seeing the fungus on the nose. Now down in Kentucky, when they were getting it there the first time, they had it on their nose. So it got expressed there first, but now it's not. Whether the fungus is changing, whether those are resistant bats, who knows?
Or maybe that's just because it was the perfect place for it to start.
Oh, without a doubt, yeah. Yes, and now go on.
Isn't there some research on the European bats that they have developed some kind of behavior that takes care of it, like they wake up every so often and they go groom each other or something like that?
Well, I haven't read the behavioral adaptations, but again, the thinking is that those bats have been exposed. They've now evolved, however, who knows how long, with that fungus. Maybe they've become resistant to it, whether it be genetic or behavioral, who knows. And yeah, that's all I can say to that issue. You know, there's different theories. Maybe the bats that are resistant are ones that don't hibernate in clusters. Maybe they're ones that do hibernate where it's less, has lower humidity. That's a possibility. One of the fascinating things is Barton Hill Mine in New York is the source of many of our, almost all of our Indiana bats in the Champlain Valley, and the numbers there have been going up. And it's a very dry and cool mine, and the fungus has not been affecting bat populations there, it seems, nearly as much. And so that's why people say, well, what about the Indiana bat in the Champlain Valley? Is it still here? It's actually one of the few places in the country that it still exists, which is amazing. Yes?
What about white nose syndrome on the other side of the Great Plains?
Yes, great question. The western states, A, know less about their bats. B, they really feel they don't have these big hibernacula with hundreds of thousands of bats. These bats literally might be hibernating in small groups in little fissures and rock ledges and so forth. Even some of the old mines in some parts of the Rockies don't have bats in them. And so they feel that maybe they don't have the same risk. And we from the East say, I wouldn't bet on anything yet because it's pretty significant effect on your bat populations. And you better be a little bit more precautious than that. Yep. Yes, a couple more, then we'll let you guys go home before any snow comes. And I can hang around here for one-on-ones.
But isn't there a huge hibernacula in Austin, on the bridge?
Well, that's not a hibernaculum. That's a summer colony of Mexican free-tailed bats. which if you haven't seen, you need to do that. It's you should be on your bucket list. There are caves down there, Bracken Cave, which has free-tailed bats in it as well. They come out for hours, like swarms for hours. But even then, people aren't sure whether those caves will get infected with white nose syndrome. That's a big question still. We do have it going down into Alabama, in Arkansas, and we're not, it's not in Texas yet, and they're hopeful that their temperatures are higher than the fungus likes. The fungus generally likes somewhere around 40 degrees to about 50 degrees. At 70 degrees, it doesn't even grow, it just stays dormant, which was really good news to us people going in the caves early on to find out that we weren't walking fungi. Yeah. Yes?
I've got a lady in Manchester that bought 8 back houses off of me and put them up on her property down there. And the first year she didn't have any. And the second year she had bats in 2 of them. And this summer she told me that she's got bats in 4 of them now.
Fantastic.
So don't hesitate to put them up. And it may take a little while for them to get them.
Right, that's great. Is she along the river?
I don't know. She lives in Long Island, but she has a bunch of property in Manchester.
That's great. Great. Wonderful. That's good news. Great. Well, thank you very much for coming out tonight. I really appreciate it. I'll stick around here if you've got any individual questions. Thanks.